Happy Pride readers. Welcome to Pride Book Fest. I am Mel, and my pronouns are she and they. I'm a queer bookstagrammer, social worker, and therapist who specializes in trauma, and I'm so excited to bring you Writing Through Grief. Today we're going to talk about writing through grief, but before we start, I just want to make sure we handle this conversation with care and remind everyone here that grief is a heavy topic. So if there's anything that comes up that feels like it's too much or we need to take a pause, let me know at any time. We want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to answer every question, but if there's a question you don't feel comfortable answering, you're welcome to pass or skip yourself and let me know to move on. So even though I'm a therapist and specialize in trauma, we're not doing therapy today, and it shouldn't feel like that. So I want to allow everybody a safe space for open conversation, and I definitely want everyone to take care of themselves as best they can during this chat, and that goes for people listening too. So let's meet our panelists.
Hi, everyone. I'll go first. I'm Eddie Boudel-Tan. My pronouns are he and him. Happy Pride. I'm the author of After Elias, my debut novel. It tells the story of a pilot's last words before he flies his airplane into the sea a week before his wedding day. And it follows his fiancée, who's left behind to struggle with the aftermath. And I also have a second book, The Rebellious Tide, coming out later this summer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mason Deaver. I'm the author of I Wish Y'all the Best and The Ghost We Keep, which is, I believe, is coming out the day that this is going live. But this is a story all about grief. Liam loses their older brother, Ethan, in a hit-and-run car accident, and things spiral from there. And they realize that the relationships that they have held on to for so long are falling apart. And in the meantime, they find comfort in Ethan's best friend, Marcus, who shows Liam that perhaps he didn't know his brother as well as he thought he might have. My pronouns are they, them, sorry.
My name is Phoebe North. My pronouns are they, them. My most recent book came out this month. It's called Strange Creatures. It's very weird for me to be holding it. Had a very long birth. It is about a brother and a sister, the magical kingdom they build in the woods. What happens when the sister believes the brother has disappeared into it, and the truth she has to deal with when he comes back. And everyone in it is super queer. It's all about them navigating grief and their queer identities, fantasy and art, and I'm super excited to talk today.
Hi, my name is Clarabelle A. Ortega. My pronouns are she, they. I'm the author of Ghost Squad, and it's a book about two best friends who are defeating some evil spirits in the city of St. Augustine. And it also has the myth of the fireflies, which is from Dominican Republic, where I'm from, that says that fireflies are the souls of your loved ones who are watching over you. So it's pretty apt for this panel. I also have another book coming out in February called Witchlings, and the This Is Our Rainbow anthology, which is coming out in October.
Well, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. I'm going to jump into my first question. So like I said a little while ago, I'm a therapist. So obviously prioritizing mental health is something that I think is really important. And I think you all probably feel the same way given what we're talking about today. So I know for a lot of people, writing is a good coping mechanism and a way to process trauma or other mental health stuff. So I wanted to ask all of you how you feel that you take care of yourselves or your mental health when writing about grief or heavier topics, or if you feel like this process of writing is your self-care.
Yeah, I can go. So for me, I find expression to be very healthy and healing, whether it's a conversation with a friend or screaming into a pillow. And in the same vein, writing I find to be very cathartic. Often I don't even know what's going to come out until it's staring at me on the page, and I go, that came from my brain. But I think just the act of expression can be very healing. So I do think that is, for me at least, a form of self-care.
I'd say for me, it's a little bit of both. It definitely is self-care in me, being able to, like Eddie said, it's can be cathartic. I let out my feelings and I sort of work through my feelings when I'm writing. But it's also, it can be, I trigger myself sometimes when I'm writing scenes about grief. It can be really hard. So I would say it's a combination of both.
My answer probably isn't helpful. I feel like I don't take care of myself as well as I should when writing about grief and about heavier topics. I do think I think that the form of writing is my way of getting these feelings out. And like I wrote The Ghost We Keep because I had to get certain feelings out about my dad and losing him. And so I think that it is the act of writing for me. I probably should be doing more. I definitely should be doing more to take care of myself. But yeah, I think writing does the job right now.
It's interesting to hear the range of answers because I kind of agree with all of them, even though they're different. I definitely trigger myself in my writing, and I don't even always consciously know what I'm triggering. Strange Creatures was a book I first tried writing when I was in college, and I didn't know why I was fascinated by the topic that's sort of at the center of it. And then through therapy and writing the book, I realized, oh, this is what I'm dealing with. It was very hard to write those kind of pieces that were at the core that were upsetting me, and I didn't always know why. But also the process of writing it, like I wasn't out as trans when I started writing this book, or when it sold. The process of writing and editing it made it very necessary for me to come out. So yeah, I definitely need to do self-care as I write. I'm a very slow writer, and I think that's part of the reason, because sometimes I can write 3,000 words a day and sometimes I can write 2 lines. Definitely, depending on my family and friends, to decompress and distract and help take care of those emotions and the person that is kind of filtering all of these feelings. It's hard. It's hard to be a writer and really get in it, but it's also very necessary, I think, for ourselves and for our readers.
So that kind of brings me into my next question, which is I'm really curious to know, especially with all of your answers for that question, if your writing process feels different when you're writing about grief or about these like topics that center grief, um, especially like keeping self care and all of that in mind.
The thing for me is everything that I write has to do with grief, whether it's like super apparent or not. Like it finds a way to like weave its way into my stories. So it's never not part of what I write. Um and sometimes I'll be like, yeah, this is like a fun, uplifting story. And then it's like, wait a minute, also it's about grief again. Um it's just unavoidable for me. So like I don't really know what writing is separate from that. Um yeah, that's my answer.
I my answer my answer feels like a cop out because I think just by default the writing process for each of the things that I write is just incredibly different from each other. With The Ghost We Keep, it became very apparent because I originally sold the idea to my editor, a child losing a father, which was way more autobiographical, and I found that I couldn't actually bring myself to write that, and I needed to take several steps away from it. And my editors were very gracious and accepted that, like, I shouldn't put myself through so much like mental pain and turmoil just to write a book. And so yeah, but I think they just kind of by default it's always changed, but grief, especially for this last go round, definitely changed some things.
Yeah, and so I do see there being a difference in my process. My work is very similar, I think, in a way to Clarabelle's, in that grief and loss are themes that do appear throughout everything I write, whether that's intentional or not from the outset. But in some of my work, it's a lot more prevalent. And what I found is when I'm writing a story that really centers on grief and trauma, it's so emotionally demanding that I need to take a break and take a few steps away after a short amount of time. There's only so much that I can give in one sitting. my first novel, After Elias, really deals about grief and loss and trauma and all these, terrible, messy things, as does my work in progress now. My second novel, The Rebellious Tide, is a lot less introspective, and it was more plot driven. And I found that I could write that all day. I was having a ball. It wasn't as emotionally demanding as some of my other work. So I was able to just write longer and be able to sustain that better.
It's interesting. We all have our things that are there in our work, kind of omnipresently. And for me, definitely grief is also one of them. I lost my dad at a super young age, and so kind of growing up surrounded by grief is my normal. Um, and my first two books are about a girl on a spaceship who is grieving a dead parent. And this book is about, a family contending with a missing child and how they deal with that reality. I have tried to write books that don't get into those things. I have written them. They weren't very good. They didn't sell. It could be my own lack of experience with a life that doesn't kind of intersect with these issues. It could be just that they weren't the right book. They were fun to write and kind of good palate cleansers until I could get back to kind of this super intense, emotionally, I don't even do gestures instead of words. But yeah, so it's probably going to be there in all of my books just because it's what I know.
So again, some of you kind of answered this question already, but my next question was, taking all of this into consideration and how, writing really is a tool to process emotions. Do you feel like it was a conscious decision to hone in on grief as a theme, or do you think it was something that kind of happened naturally?
I can speak for my first book. So for me, grief is all about loss, and that's something that really fascinates me. The entire premise of my first novel was the fear of losing everything, and I knew from the beginning that that's what I wanted to write about. It's something that I've always struggled with, and just to be transparent, I have a very full and fulfilling life, like a fairly privileged life. But I'm still a queer man. I'm the son of Asian immigrants whose own parents were refugees. I think I've always been just acutely aware of how fragile everything is and how quickly things can be taken away from us and how easily progress can revert. So I've always gone through life with this fear that everything that I gain and every step forward I make, that could just be taken away so easily. And that feeling has often intensified the happier I became and the more stable and secure my life ended up being. I would have more to lose, right? Is the underlying sense that I have learned to live with. And so I knew that was going to be the premise of my first novel, After Elias. I wanted to take someone who, at least on the surface, appears to have everything, and then take it all away from them in one tragic event. So that character ended up becoming Cohen, the protagonist of After Elias, who loses his fiancee a week before his wedding day. But that's really just the catalyst to his own journey of self discovery and healing and facing all of the unpleasant, messy truths that he had opted to ignore up until that point.
I can go. Mostly because my answer is such a non-answer. Yeah, it obviously very purposeful to hone in on the grief with writing the Ghost We Keep. I really wanted, specifically, I felt like my mission was to showcase how messy it is and how it's it's different for each person that experiences it. I don't really think that the same two people have um the same experience with grief. Some things can overlap and be similar, of course, but I think that for each person it's an individual journey, and I wanted to showcase just how messy and how imperfect it is, how it can turn you into someone that you don't like or maybe not even recognize, the damage that it can do to your relationships, but how it can potentially even open you up to other people in a way. And that was sort of what I not sort of what I wanted to do. It was what I wanted to do, and I personally think that I accomplished it. I don't know. I'll have to see how other people react to it.
When I wrote Strange Creatures, I was uh, my second agent had just left the industry, and I really didn't know what was next in my career. And in a lot of ways, I think this book with these dark of themes, I might not have written had I known what the road ahead was. But I really told myself I'm going to write um, the book of my heart's a cliche, but that book that really, really speaks to me. And it wasn't necessarily the missing child story or the queer identity. I wanted to write a big, weird book about how we become artists. And that is essentially what this book is. Are all artists traumatized people dealing with grief? No. Are all artists kind of filtering their experiences through that grief? Are there people who experience grief who aren't artists? Sure, like all of that is true. There's a diversity of experiences, but I wanted to write this big, strange book that really spoke to those experiences that I had had, and those are intrinsically ones that overlap with having a grieving family.
I definitely set out to write about grief when it came to Ghost Squad, because it was sort of the book that helped me deal with my brother's death. And like the story of the fireflies is really something personal to me because we used to catch fireflies when we were little together. And so then to write a book that's sort of like, what if I could still have him around, which is like what I wanted more than anything. So I wrote it because of that. It's sort of like, if I could choose one thing, it would be for this myth to be real, right? But that's the point of the myth too, to sort of like comfort us. And it's something that I never read about before. It's sort of like a word of mouth thing that you learn in Dominican culture. So I said, it would be really great to have this in like a text that people could refer to and like read and children could read about. And then it snuck its way into other books. Like I said, like even my graphic novel Frizzy, which is about curly hair, there's there's not like death in the book, but there is grief in the book. There is the a family member that's not around anymore, and that's like part of the narrative. So even when it's like very removed from like the idea of it, it always just like sneaks its way in because I just don't know how to tell stories without that. It's just such a big part of who I am, and it's the way that I can relate most to readers. So yeah, for Ghost Squad it was intentional. The other ones it wasn't, but it happened anyway.
I love that. I think that that's it seems like all of you kind of like have both of those sides where it's it is intentional, but it's also not at the same time. So I love that you all have shared that. So my next question would be, in terms of the themes that we're talking about today, obviously grief is something that like all people experience, but also this is Pride Book Fest and we're all queer, so we're focusing on that too. So I know there's a big theme of just trauma in the queer community and a lot of stories about queer people experiencing trauma related to their identities. So in writing about traumatic loss and grief for queer characters specifically, and keeping in mind all of that and all of the just like collective trauma that is experienced as a queer person, um, were you all like conscious of how just being queer could impact the intensity of the grief that was being felt? Was that something that you all like thought a lot about in writing these characters and these stories?
Yeah, I can go. It's something that I really wrestled with as I was writing After Elias because it is so heavy and it does confront trauma and tragedy and grief head on. Um, and I was just very aware that we have so many traumatic stories in queer literature and in queer art. I've thought long and hard about, do we need more? And the conclusion that I reached is this. Yes, because that reflects a lot of our experiences. At least it does for me. Our community is still subjected to abuse and discrimination and hatred. there's a big portion of the world, like over 70 countries, in which we could be imprisoned just for being who we are. Our queer LGBTQ plus teenagers are multitudes more likely to harm themselves than their non-LGBTQ plus counterparts. So for me, like, how do we ignore the reality of grief and trauma in our community if we don't, confront it head on? I do believe like we need more happy stories and a wider range of stories, absolutely. But for Afterlife, my goal was to not deny trauma nor joy. Like, there are moments of joy and happiness, and there are moments of abject terror and sadness, just like there are in real life. And I certainly didn't want to downplay trauma. That was also a conscious decision. Like, it's something that we all experience. I think it's in one form or another. It comes in different shapes and sizes, different volumes. Sometimes it's really loud, but often it's really quiet. And I wanted to be able to reflect that in my work. And for me, the trauma and the cause of the trauma is one thing, but what is most meaningful, I think, and at least the stories that I write, is what happens after, right? Like, how does one respond to that? How do they process that grief and their emotions? What do they learn along the way? What is that healing process? I think that's where it becomes more meaningful and impactful, is looking at what happens after the trauma.
So not all my books have a queer main character, but I'll speak about my the short story that I wrote for the This Is Our Rainbow anthology, which is like it's a middle grade queer anthology, which has never been done before, and it's really exciting. And I again, all my books are like self-insert. Like, I wish this would happen to me, and like my family's from the Caribbean, so like being queer from the Caribbean is like very, very, very taboo. And it is not something that's easy. So in the story, I really wanted to have her, my main character's name is Flor. And Flor is sort of like discovering their identity. And I wanted it to be a happy experience for them, only because I never got that. So I was like, I want sort of like the Schitt's Creek treatment where it's like there's not going to be any homophobia in this. But I do agree with Eddie. Like, I feel like there's room for both kinds of narratives. And I think a lot of times when people say like, oh, we've already had enough stories about like coming out and pain, they're not taking into account stories about like BIPOC authors a lot of times too. Like, authors of color have been like pushed to the sides when it comes to a lot of narratives, and we're like just getting our chance to tell these stories. So I think that there's always going to be kids who need those stories. So I think there's room for both of them. But for me, I wanted to go like the joyful approach. Also, because they're 12 in the story, and I was like, no, my baby. I have a hard time putting them through things, but yeah.
I think it's a hard question, because when I wrote Strange Creatures, as I said, I was in the closet still. And originally the ending was very different. It was not as uplifting an ending. I buried a gay. And a lot of that was about kind of what I saw as my own prospects for myself. So I actually had a lot of very active conversations with my editor about how much trauma, the types of endings we're giving the characters, because there's a lot of trauma in this book, and you can't really whitewash that. However, I do think it's important to show readers a road out of that pain as well. And there are some people historically for there wasn't always a road out. And I think when we're talking about these tropes, it's good to be aware of that too, that, in the 60s when we had pulp lesbian novels, which were very subversive, they literally had to bury their gays. And that was part of them getting these stories out at all. But I really do think it's a balance. Like, we need to address authentically what still is happening to a lot of queer kids and grown-ups. And we also need to show that there's community and that there's joy. And I don't think the necessity for either of those is a negative.
Sort of piggybacking off of what both Eddie and Clarabelle said, in that there's a place on the shelf for both, like these positive, like happy fluffy love stories, and like these stories about trauma and grief. I almost feel as if it's necessary to, well, not almost, it is necessary to have them both, I think. It was actually in reading Story Genius by Lisa Cron that I think it's Lisa. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. Um, she has a line in that book that's all about how people will go to books to help them solve issues that they don't know that, or they may not know that they have, but sometimes they are aware. Sorry, I'm mixing up my words. But people go to books to solve issues that they have, even if they don't know that they have those problems. And so I think that it's very necessary to have this wide array of stories, especially queer stories, especially stories by BIPOC authors, where in our field in YA and middle grade and adult, I think it's important that people have this wide variety of stories that they can pull lessons from. Um, and I think that both need to have their place on the shelf. They need to coexist with each other. When it came to writing The Ghost We Keep, I was very worried about what the feedback would be about putting queer characters through so much trauma and so much grief. And at a point, I just kind of had to reconcile with it, in that the book was first and foremost going to be for me. So the book is like an entirely selfish thing. Um, it's the book that I wanted to write. It's the book that I needed to write to get out of me. It's a book that I could have used during the processing of my father's death and other deaths that I have struggled with in my life. And so I think that at a point, at a point, I just decided it was going to be just a book for me, and just for me. And if anyone else could relate to it or share that experience, then that was just going to be a plus.
Thank you all for sharing that. I know that I think for me, when I was thinking of that question, I was thinking of it in a way that we see a lot of stories that center trauma because somebody's queer. And I think traumatic grief and loss is something that everybody experiences. But I think I personally feel like all of these stories are important for queer people to see that they their traumas are not always just because they're queer, and there's all of these experiences that everybody has, whether you're queer or you're not queer, but we don't always get to read stories of people that identify the same way as us going through the same things, even when it doesn't relate to our identity, which I think is kind of like an open statement to make because everything relates to our identity. But in keeping all of that in mind, I feel like this is kind of an obvious question, but why do you all feel like it's so important for these stories to get in the hands of queer readers?
I can go. I don't think it's an obvious question,
Okay.
because there are probably so many different answers to this. But I mean, the power of literature is to instill empathy and allow people to view the world through the eyes of someone else. But it's equally important for people to be able to view the world through the eyes that are kind of like them, right? And I think that's the power of our books, to allow people who are going through similar situations to know that they're not alone, and this is a path that others have taken, and they've made it to the end. Even if it is a fictional account, it represents what we see in real life. So I think it's really important for people to lean on these stories to feel less alone, I think, in whatever they're dealing with.
I agree with Eddie. Whenever I write a book, I think about kids who don't have access to things like, a parent who is going to comfort them or be able to understand what they're going through, or that they can talk to, or an older person in their life at all. A lot of times, the book is the only thing that they have to make them feel better, or the only thing that they have that can make them see like I'm not alone, like Eddie said. And it can be the only tool that they have to sort of like survive, which sounds really bleak, but for kids who are like in like underprivileged communities, especially in like communities of color, it can be really difficult to be queer and to be out. And if you are at all, if you are at all, you know, so if I can give them like a book where they can see themselves in and feel comfort and say, wait a minute, maybe like when I get out of here, things can be okay. Like there's hope for me somewhere, you know, because this person found it, then that is like the whole purpose of like why I write, like for kids to not feel by themselves and to feel like, okay, I have hope. There can be a place for me in this world, even if I haven't found it just yet.
I think Eddie and Clarabelle both captured that feeling like perfectly with their answers. Like yeah, it is just about hope for me, and always having what I think are hopeful endings to my stories, because I want, especially since I write young adult, I want teenagers who are at such an impressionable age to know that there is this sort of light at the end of the tunnel, that the feelings that they have are completely natural, and like they're okay, like they're not they're not wrong or anything like that. Like yeah, it's just about wanting to help kids realize that things are like going to be okay.
Yeah, definitely. I I think it's interesting that like the intersection of queerness and grief can impact each other even if your grief isn't about your queerness. And it impacts the type of community you might have in your family of origin, the types of support you might have. It impacts how you're perceived at school, that sort of thing. And I really wanted in my book to show one of the POV characters, Annie, going through this experience where her queerness at home, it's not really quite a problem, but it impacts the support she has. But then she goes on to college at the end of the book, and she finds a bunch of queer people to go to the diner with and, you know, talk about gay things, and it feels wonderful. She also goes to therapy in the book, and I just really wanted to show that there are different types of support out there, because as much as your queerness can intersect grief, it can also intersect the support you have, sometimes in really wonderful ways. And I think the queer community is just so supportive and wonderful and can really, really help. And if there's anything I can say to teenagers, it's that this community exists and you're a part of it, and come to us if you need things.
I love that, and I think it's so important to see, like, that whole, like, range of things and support and all of that too. Um, so in writing this topic and these types of things, how do you all feel like you find a balance, or if you have found that balance between writing the hard stuff with the good stuff, especially when you are writing for, you know, younger readers or writing younger characters?
My books are full of jokes. Like it's like joke, 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 sad thing happened, more jokes. So I try to always have like definitely a balance of like humor. Friendship is like a big thing in my books too. Having that banter back and forth and making the reader feel like they're the other friend who's like tagging along with this group of kids um, on an adventure. I tried to make it more about that, about the story and the characters and the things that happen to them. Sometimes do suck and are sad. And the things that they're dealing with are really hard, but that's not your whole life, right? Like when you're dealing with grief, it's not like you just have like a cloud over your head all the time. Like there are moments of sunshine, and like I try to show that in my books, that it's like it's a full life even when you're dealing with something that's really, really hard.
Yeah,
I love
agree.
that. I think like if you've experienced trauma, there's nothing like trauma to sharpen your sense of humor a lot of the time. You know, my spouse as well has experienced his share of trauma, and we have some great gallows humor that sometimes gets us the side eye a little bit. I don't know that I always balance it. My books are dark, and I'm upfront about the fact that they're dark. They have characters taking part joyously in things they love, getting obsessive about bands or whatever. But I've just kind of confronted the fact that there might be little bits of wry humor, but they are dark. And, I think sometimes we just need that and we need to write it.
Yeah, definitely. I'll admit that I can't not read the reviews for my books. I know that goes against the typical author wisdom, but I can't help it because I'm weak. But my favorite reviews are the ones when people say that my book made them cry and laugh, sometimes in the same sitting. Like, it's not meant to be comedic, I'll tell you that. Like, that's a disclaimer. But I and I did really try to reflect the broad spectrum of emotions, right, that exists in our lives. And in any given day, we can go from one extreme to the other. So I wanted my book to be able to reflect that. Everything from light and joy to darkness and sadness and grief, to be able to reflect that and celebrate all of it. So if I'm able to make someone laugh and cry in the same sitting, then I can't help but be proud of that, because I write to provoke an emotional and intellectual reaction from readers. So that gives me a bit of a sign that I'm doing something right.
I don't know if how I did this was like very purposeful. I think I just tried to sort of imitate real life. It's like Clarabelle said, like whenever you're dealing with grief, it's not as if you have this storm cloud over your head 24/7 that just magically goes away after a certain period of time. I think that I tried to use the character of Marcus in The Ghost We Keep, who is Ethan's best friend and someone who Liam has known almost their entire life because of Ethan and Marcus's friendship. And so it was through Liam and Marcus sort of reuniting with each other and growing closer that I was able to have these two just kind of get to know each other all over again, which involved, the two of them finding out how they grieve, but also just like just hanging out. Like it's nothing, it wasn't like anything super special. Like I don't think I planned for it. It's just that like these moments of levity came out with these two like kids who were sort of close in age, but they're still like Marcus is the cool older siblings friend who just seems like so impossibly cool, and like you want to be friends with them whenever you're like 6, and it's like, oh, like I want to hang out with the big kids. But Liam is finally getting to do that. So I think that Marcus became a tool in that, and also Liam's parents, who again are going through the same kind of grief but in a different way, and the nice moments that I got to have between Liam and their parents. Also, I think sort of counterbalance the heavier points of the book.
Yeah, and going off of what you're saying, Mason, I this question is for everybody, but I think it might have been influenced by me reading The Ghost You Keep. Um, but so this is kind of a bunch of questions wrapped into one, so answer whichever parts you want to. But so obviously, like, everybody grieves differently, and even if you're experiencing the same loss, like, 2 people are not gonna feel the same when they experience that loss. So when you're writing side characters, what do you feel like is your process of, like, crafting their experience of grief? And do you feel like it's like, how do you feel like it's different from the main character's expression? And along with that too, do you feel like one's identity or queerness affects their grieving process, like, when you're thinking about how you want their process to look like?
Um, I I tried to, specifically for this book, I always tried to think about where the other character was coming from. It's a book told in first person perspective, so essentially, unless a character spouts about how they're feeling, Liam is only going to know the surface level or like read their face and like maybe be able to tell something. But I tried to always think about where this person was coming from. I always tried to think about Marcus in a sense that like Marcus is someone who knew this boy almost his entire life, who was gone from him suddenly, who there there's spoilers in the book, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but like Ethan was someone who was incredibly important to Marcus, like his childhood best friend, someone who he loved, and to suddenly just not have him and to think about what that might do to him, a lot of it came from not an experience with grief, but with suddenly in high school, I had this best friend who just one day was gone. And I don't want the conversation to get dark, but I later found out that his mother sent him to a conversion therapy kind of place program, whatever you want to call that bullshit. Um, and so I really recalled those feelings about just suddenly not having someone who I considered very close in my life, my best friend. Um, and with the parents, I remembered my mother's emotions the days after my father died and what it felt like to just look at her and what she was experiencing and not knowing exactly what was going on in her head. And months later, when she admitted certain things to me, it was almost like everything clicked into to place, almost like a puzzle that was being completed. So really when it came to that, I really just tried to think about where the character was coming from. And then on the flip side of that queerness, I one thing I specifically did with the character of Joel, and again I don't want to like spoil it, but Joel is a trans boy who never had the chance to come out to his grandmother before she died, and I think it's a good moment in the book. So again, I don't want to spoil anything, but Joel has a monologue about what it's like to have basically been someone else when this person you love died, and them not knowing who you truly are, like who you really are as a person. And I thought about that a lot with my dad because he didn't know that I'm trans whenever he died. And I just I centered in on this feeling of like he died thinking that I was someone else. And what sort of emotions that might pull from me. And so some of that stuff in the book is verbatim, stuff that I've said to myself and said to friends. Yeah, it was very tricky, and I don't know how I really pulled it off. I guess I just really just wrote like what was closest to me, in a way.
I just want to say too, I think that even with this question, right, like saying that, all these different people are experiencing grief differently, I think it shows too, like, and I think in all of your books, not just Mason, but, since Mason already said this, but the experience of just grieving as one person can vary so drastically that, you know, it sounds like the experiences of even just your own grief kind of transferred into different characters experiencing grief in different ways.
Yeah, definitely for me, I think like you can't compare grief among each other. It's like they're all so different. It comes in different shapes and sizes, and just because one person is grieving the loss of someone who perhaps may be closer to them doesn't mean their grief is any bigger or more substantial and significant than anyone else's. So it's really impossible to compare. For me, the thing that really struck me when I wrote the peripheral characters around Cohen, my protagonist, who suffers the loss of his fiance, was like it brought me back to the feeling that I feel when someone that I love has lost something or someone that was really close to them. And that feeling is helplessness, like just complete uselessness. Like I'm often grieving at the same time, but I'm trying to be there for my friend. I want to, support them, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do that. I don't know what actions to take, and it's that feeling of helplessness that, through my own experience, made its way into the book, and that the friends around Cohen are feeling kind of helpless, and actually. Cohen sees this in the people in his life, and when he suffers a loss, he describes that feeling like this: it is more complicated than sadness, it's more severe than concern, it is tenderness and love and anger and fear. They see me and know there's nothing they can do to help me. And that line really is Cohen's observation. But that's just me describing what I feel like when someone that I love has suffered severe loss. It's, what do you do? There's no playbook in how to behave.
I have a POV character who was originally a side character, so I don't know that I'm always that successful because she kept demanding a bigger part in the story. However, I think in the book, when other characters are looking at these characters and reacting to them, they have teachers, they have friends, and often their reactions feel insufficient to the person who's grieving, and they will always feel insufficient. I think the quote that Eddie read is completely apt and perfect, because it really is a total helplessness, and someone can say something to you that they believe is perfect and uplifting, and you just know it doesn't land. And I think that's a really common experience with grief, especially when you're a teenager, and even if you're deeply grieving and hurting, you want to react cynically to other people. I think that's often a natural reaction when you're a grieving teenager. Um, it's it's almost fun to write those side characters bumbling through it. I feel like it was a little cathartic for me when I had people say things that they believed were really helpful. He's with God now, that kind of thing, when you're like, doesn't help me at all right now. But I think the ways that communities form around grieving people or not, and the ways that people let themselves be accepted into those communities for various reasons, are really interesting. And I think it's interesting to write.
All right. So to bring it to like a completely different note, I wanted to ask all of you. I know, Eddie, you said you can't help but read reviews, but I know not everybody does read reviews. But I know that in terms of like the book reviewer community, there's a lot of mixed feelings on content warnings and including content warnings in reviews. So I wanted to ask what all of your feelings are on that, and if you feel like they should be included in reviews from people who have already read the book, or if they should be included in like a synopsis of the book, or like before, the book actually starts, or, just general stuff like that. So does anybody have any thoughts on just content warnings in general?
I can say for my book, it's one of my biggest regrets that it didn't come with a content warning. I look back and I just think, oh, hopefully there's another printing, and then we can put that in there, because like it's interesting in that people seem divided in this, because who does it hurt, right? To put a content warning, whether it's a review or in front of a book or a film or a show. It's just about trying to protect people's health and expectations, and I really don't see a downside, but that's my perspective.
I agree. I feel like it it can only help people, really. And I think that the argument that I've seen the most against it is like it's spoilers, and I'm like, don't read that page. Like it's okay. Like it's spoilers versus this could potentially trigger someone to spiral and have like a really bad breakdown. I feel like it doesn't add up for me. So I'm a huge supporter of trigger warnings and content warnings and all of that. And I've seen a lot of authors will put it on their websites when they're not in the book. So that's like an option that people can do also in the meantime. But I think they're great.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to put the content warnings on my website so they're accessible to the readers. And if I always say, like, if I missed something, like, please email me if you think something needs to be added to this. Just feel free to let me know, and I'll see if it needs to be added. I think it's a weirdly strange thing to be against. Like, this is the hill that you're gonna die on, is that someone's experience in remaining comfortable and sort of like mentally centered is like it's such a weird thing to argue against content warnings. Like what are you doing?
I realize my own reaction to this is a little idiosyncratic, but as a person who has had CPTSD and been in treatment for it. I used to be super pro trigger and content warning, and I still support if reviewers want to put them in. The research I've read on it, and this meshes with my own experience, is that you're actually more likely to read things that are triggering with a content warning. So I don't know where I fall on them now. I want to protect people with CPTSD and PTSD and other disorders that may be triggered, but also I want to make sure that they actually are helped by them. And the research that I've read, at least, is not unanimous on that. So it's also hard because the things that I was triggered by are rarely the things that are warned. And I think that's fairly common. So I don't know. I feel like my feelings are always evolving. I think that as a community, they're a sign that we're listening to people about their experiences with mental health, and they show that we care about them as a community. And so I like them in that way. I will say for myself, going through the experience of doing EMDR therapy and having my triggers actually be gradually reduced was the best thing, more than avoidance. And I think I would love for that to be more accessible to more people, or exposure therapy as a society. I think these are things that we need to get out there, that they are available to help.
Thank you all for that. I never realized that there was research on that showed that people are more likely to gravitate towards things that might trigger them. That's interesting. Um, so I personally agree with like what all of you said. I think that it's an important thing just so people are aware, and then what they choose to do with that or how they proceed from there. I think is up to the reader. But in terms of just you all as readers, along with being writers, what are some stories that you've read that like either are your own or are not your own that you feel like have really good representation of grief or have made you feel seen in one way or another?
Can I say two? Because
Yeah, say however many you want.
two come to mind immediately, and they're both very different. So the first one is a novel called Some Help by Patrick Nathan, and I really admire it because it is unrelenting in its depiction of grief and trauma and everything that comes with it. It's loud and it's quiet all at the same time, and there's no levity. It's just like pure, like the purest depiction of grief in literature that I've come across. And my second one is Tin Man by Sarah Winman, which happens to be one of my favorite books. And the reason I put this in here is because the grief is so quiet, and unless you're really paying attention, it may not even come across as grief because it's presented as regret and longing and all of these quieter, easier to digest emotions. But what it comes down to is it's grief and it's trauma, and I think it's really insightful in that grief can show itself in so many different forms and so many different emotions, and I think Tin Man just brings that to life so beautifully.
I also have two, both from both from the same author, but More Happy Than Not and History Is All You Left Me, both by Adam Silvera, are two books that really struck me. History Is All You Left Me, it's so it's they're hard to describe in the way that they hit me. It's so palpable, and it felt so real. Like I don't think I had ever read a book that talked about grief in the way that History did. Um, and seeing the before and after, um, and how these relationships changed over time, it hit me very hard. And then More Happy Than Not, um, which at I think most people at first wouldn't necessarily think about it as a book of grief, but like the main character is grieving his father, and the sort of slow reveals through the book as to what's happened. It it really hit me upside the head like a baseball bat. And I think Adam is very good at capturing these very specific emotions. Um, that I really related to and really resonated in me.
For me, one of the books that really captures like losing a sibling really well is The Devouring Grey by Christine Lynn Herman. Um, it has one of the characters dealing with the loss of a sibling, and the way that they sort of wrote about it and like captured the experience really spoke to me and really felt very real. And it was sort of the first time that I had, since losing my brother, that I had read something that just felt like it wasn't just telling the story of grief, but it was actually like showing you what it is. So that one's mine.
Um, I think the work of Linda Barry, who's a comic artist, especially her Marlis and Mabon comics, they're older, but they're fantastic in just showing this family that has very unique experiences, including types of grief and how they're coping or not coping through them. And they are just some of the most authentic pieces of literature about growing up like that I've ever read.
Well, thank you all for sharing that. I know you, in one way or another, have probably answered this question already, but going off of those books and everything that we've already talked about, do you want to share just a little bit about what you feel like your biggest influences were in writing these stories that we talked about today?
I can go. So for After Elias, I'm going to try to not go on a tangent here, but the biggest influence for my first novel is the LGBTQ plus community. I often describe After Elias as a modern queer tragedy. And what I mean by that is, at least in much of the Western world, we're living in this era in which we have corporate sponsored pride festivals, we have marriage equality, we have all these amazing things that previous generations have had to fight for. But the reality is, it could be taken away just like that. And so, in a lot of ways, After Elias reflects that. Cohen, to me, reflects the optimism that I often see in the LGBTQ plus community, and that's a lovely thing and something to celebrate. But at the same time, there is the other reality in that all the progress we've made can be taken away if we are not vigilant, and that's why the strength of our community and our visibility and things like pride are so important, because that is us, standing together in solidarity and ensuring that we are going to be moving forward together, and not let ourselves be pulled backwards.
I think for me, a a big influence that I just talked about was History Is All You Left Me, Adam Silvera. I think I kept that book like on like beside my computer the entire time while writing one of the drafts of The Ghost We Keep. But other influences that I think would surprise people, maybe not if they know me, are the movies of Ari Aster, Midsummer and Hereditary. They are two movies that I adore and I actively rewatched constantly while writing and drafting The Ghost We Keep. Like they are horror movies, but I think that beyond that, at the core, those are two movies that are about grief. People processing the death of people close to them. In Hereditary, it's a mother and then a child, and then Midsummer, it's parents and a sister, and also a relationship. So I think I kept those two pretty much on loop while drafting.
Um, I was influenced a lot by like things like Goosebumps and like kids movies like that I grew up watching. That always, in terms of the movies at least, always had like a layer of like fighting for something that you're about to lose, like the Goonies, and just being a kid and being underestimated and being misunderstood. Um, and that really influenced me a lot. And then also, my heritage and my culture. We have a lot of stories that we tell one another, that we pass on to one another, that are really old and that stick around for a reason, because they're meant to give us comfort. They're meant to be tools to help us get through life. And I wanted to share those tools with other people, and that was like a big inspiration for me.
I have behind me, my weird bookshelf is up there, and it has books like Cloud Atlas and some Mark Danielewski and Tristram Shandy and all sorts of things like that that are really creative and play with form and are strange. And I wanted to create a book like that for teenagers were like me. And I think of those books, there's one, among others, by Jo Walton, which describes a teenage girl in the 70s dealing with being nerdy and withdrawn and and also magic, and how she becomes a writer. And I think reading that was almost instructive to me as to how you could approach that kind of topic.
Well, thank you all for sharing all of that. I really appreciate that we got to talk about this stuff. Does anybody have any last thoughts before we finish that they want to share?
I just want to thank the organizers of the Pride Book Fest. I think this is amazing. You know, there are a lot of literary festivals out there, but this one truly feels like a celebration of all things queer and all things pride, and it's something that we all need as a community. So kudos to you for bringing us together.
All right. Anybody have anything else? I agree. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Anybody watching and listening, thanks for sticking it out with us for this hour. And thank you all for being like vulnerable and sharing everything that you shared today. I'm grateful to have shared this space with you all.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for all your questions. They were
you.
great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mel.